Annie Hargrove was known as the quiet elderly innkeeper with a fondness for cats and herbal tea. But beneath her soft-spoken charm was a chilling secret that would unravel the lives of Michael Redford, Lily Tran, Paul Merrick, and Naomi Sato. Each of them checked into Hollow Creek Guesthouse, searching for peace, but none of them ever checked out. What began as a peaceful retreat soon turned into the hunting ground of a woman hiding a decade-long killing spree behind lace curtains and polite smiles. In the quiet stretches of Vermont's countryside, nestled among tall pine trees and winding gravel roads, stood the Hollow Creek Guesthouse. With its rustic wooden beams, ivy-covered walls, and antique charm, it seemed like the perfect escape for city-weary travelers, the kind of place that promised crackling fireplaces, homemade meals, and uninterrupted peace. It had been run for nearly 2 decades by Annie Hargrove, a woman in her late 60s who kept mostly to herself. Locals described her as polite, though distant, someone who preferred the company of her cats and her garden to the hustle of modern life. In early 2016, Hollow Creek began gaining traction on travel blogs and social media as a hidden gem. Backpackers, writers, and students looking for solitude started booking short stays. But that spring, something disturbing started happening. Guests began to disappear. One by one, quietly. At first, no one connected the dots. A British traveller named Michael Redford never boarded his return flight. His family assumed he extended his trip until weeks passed without a single call or email. Then a college student, Lily Tran, failed to return to campus after spring break. Her friends thought she had dropped out or gone off the grid, but her bank account was never touched again. The pattern was subtle, spaced out just enough to avoid immediate suspicion. The missing guests had little in common. Different backgrounds, different states, different reasons for travel, all solitary, all staying at Hollow Creek and all seemingly vanishing into thin air. There was no sign of struggle. Their rental cars were sometimes found parked in front of the guest house, keys still in the ignition. Belongings were missing or left behind in odd places. One guest's journal was found tossed in a creek a mile away, pages torn out. When families reported their loved ones missing, police made initial inquiries. They visited Hollow Creek, where Annie greeted them with calm hospitality. She explained that guests often came and went at odd hours. Some stayed only one night and left without notice. She showed receipts, simple handwritten notes that matched the guests' names and dates. With no signs of foul play and no physical evidence, officers had little reason to suspect her. The disappearances were officially classified as unrelated missing person cases. Still, a quiet unease settled over the town. Locals started whispering about the guest house. A few claimed to see strange lights in the woods behind it late at night. One delivery driver said he stopped bringing supplies after noticing that Annie always paid in cash and never let him step inside. But there was no proof of anything. Just stories. By the end of the summer, 4 people had gone missing, all linked to Hollow Creek. Yet the place remained open, taking new guests every few weeks. The guest house's online presence quietly vanished. No more glowing reviews, no more updates. It was as if the place itself began retreating into the shadows, just like the people who stayed there. And still, no one could explain how so many could vanish without a trace, all under the same roof. In early spring of 2017, the mystery surrounding Hollow Creek Guesthouse remained unsolved. The disappearances had slowed public interest, but hadn't stopped the whispers. Despite the growing suspicion among some locals, the police had no solid leads. The old guest house stood quietly among the trees, its windows shuttered and its driveway coated in layers of fallen leaves. From a distance it looked abandoned, but the truth was far more unsettling. Annie Hargrove still lived there alone, and behind her closed doors, secrets remained buried. That March, a handyman named Theo Bridges was hired to repair a leaking pipe in the guest house's kitchen. Theo had done occasional work around town and was known for his attention to detail. It was a typical job, or so he thought. While inspecting the plumbing near the kitchen floorboards, he noticed a small draft coming from beneath a heavy rug in the hallway. Curious, he moved the rug aside and found a narrow wooden door, old and worn, with a heavy padlock secured to its latch. When he asked Annie about it, her demeanor shifted instantly. Her usual calm vanished. She told him the door led to a storage area full of broken furniture and that it hadn't been used in years. Her voice was flat, almost rehearsed. Then, without another word, she insisted he pack his tools and leave. Theo did as he was told, but the encounter left a lasting impression. Something felt off, not just the locked door, but Annie's sudden defensiveness, her cold stare. He mentioned the incident to a friend, who then tipped off the police. It wasn't long before investigators returned to Hollow Creek, this time with a search warrant. When officers entered the house, they found it eerily silent. Dust floated through beams of light streaming in from cracked windows. Annie sat in her armchair, watching them quietly, saying nothing. The officers moved through the house room by room until they reached the padlocked basement door Theo had described. It took bolt cutters and several minutes of struggle before they finally pried it open. A narrow staircase led downward into darkness. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of rot and mildew. Flashlights illuminated the walls, lined with old newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and strange markings scrawled in ink. At the foot of the stairs, officers found a large room filled with disturbing items. 4 suitcases rested against the wall, tagged with name labels matching the missing guests. Each suitcase contained personal belongings, blood-stained clothes, torn maps, journals, and identification cards. Nearby, they found tools, rusted hammers, garden shears, duct tape, and rope. A small metal shelf held jars filled with what appeared to be preserved items, locks of hair, teeth, even fingers. But most chilling of all were dozens of photographs scattered across a table. The images showed the victims asleep in their beds, taken from inside the rooms, clearly without their knowledge. Someone had been watching them, studying them. Despite this disturbing discovery, no bodies were found. The physical evidence strongly suggested murder, but without corpses, charges couldn't be filed. Annie was taken in for questioning, but her answers were vague and calculated. She denied everything, claimed the items were planted, and maintained that she had never harmed anyone. With no concrete proof of death, the law could not hold her. The guest house was closed indefinitely, the basement sealed off. But the town remained unsettled. People now believed something terrible had happened there, but they still didn't know just how terrible it truly was. 2 years passed without answers. Hollow Creek Guest House stood empty, its windows boarded and its gates rusting shut. The surrounding forest began to reclaim the land, with vines creeping up the porch railings and moss overtaking the stone steps. The basement, sealed and left untouched, held its dark secrets in silence. Despite the media attention and the occasional investigator trying to revive interest, the case of the missing guests faded slowly from the headlines. With no bodies and no official arrests, people moved on. At least, most did. In the summer of 2019, the case took an unexpected turn. A woman named Claire Renshaw came forward, claiming she had once stayed at Hollow Creek and survived something terrible. She had been following the story quietly, haunted by her own experience. For years, she had convinced herself it was just a bad dream or a figment of fear. But after seeing a late-night documentary that showed photos of the missing victims, something clicked. She recognized their faces, not from the news, but from breakfast at the guest house. Claire had stayed at Hollow Creek in April 2016. She was traveling cross-country alone, trying to clear her head after a divorce. On her second night there, she felt uneasy. She remembered creaking sounds beneath the floor at night, and the way Annie Hargrove would silently appear in the hallway, staring but never speaking. She dismissed it at first. Old houses made noises. Hosts were sometimes eccentric. But by the third night, that sense of discomfort turned into something much darker. Claire described waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone had been in her room. Her suitcase had been unzipped and her shoes were missing. The lock on her door, which she swore she had bolted, was wide open. The final straw came when she discovered a tiny hole drilled through her ceiling light fixture, just big enough to fit the lens of a camera. She packed to leave at dawn but never made it out the front door. According to her, she was ambushed, tied up and blindfolded. She couldn't recall the face of her attacker, but the voice was soft, almost gentle. She was told not to scream, not to struggle. But Claire did both. She managed to roll herself off the bed and break a glass lamp, using a shard to cut through the cords. She escaped through a back window and ran through the woods barefoot, covered in cuts and bruises. She never reported it. She was scared, confused, and ashamed. She feared no one would believe her, and a part of her desperately wanted to forget it ever happened. But now, seeing the faces of the missing guests, people who were likely there the same week she was, forced her to come forward. Claire's story reignited the investigation. She gave police exact dates, described the layout of the house, and pointed them to areas in the surrounding woods she had run through that night. Investigators returned to Hollow Creek with fresh urgency. They brought cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They no longer hoped for answers. They were determined to uncover the truth that had been buried for far too long. The renewed investigation into Hollow Creek led officers deep into the dense, tangled woods surrounding the guest house. Using Claire Renshaw's testimony as a guide, search teams fanned out across the forest, focusing on areas she remembered. Fleeing through. It didn't take long before the dogs alerted in a remote patch of land about a mile from the house. The area, known to locals as Crow's Hollow, had a long-forgotten reputation for being eerily quiet and rarely visited. Overgrown and cloaked in thick underbrush, it was the perfect place to hide something or someone. Shovels hit something solid within the first few hours. What they uncovered was a shallow grave containing a decomposed human skeleton curled into a fetal position. Over the next 2 days, 3 more burial sites were discovered in close proximity. All were shallow, all marked by nothing but the soft depressions in the ground that time had nearly erased. Forensic teams worked carefully, cataloguing each site. The skeletons showed clear signs of foul play, multiple fractures, skull trauma, and traces of binding around the limbs. It was clear now. These weren't missing persons anymore. They were murder victims. Each body was found with remnants of clothing and personal items that helped confirm their identities. Michael Redford, Lily Tran, Paul Merrick, and Naomi Sato. The guests who had checked into Hollow Creek and never checked out. Their families were notified, and the news made headlines across the country. The disappearances were no longer mysteries. They were part of a serial killing spree, hidden behind the polite smile of a guest house owner. But one discovery left everyone speechless. The 5th grave. Buried slightly deeper than the others, the 5th skeleton had decayed beyond easy recognition. But a gold wedding band on the left hand stood out. Engraved inside the ring were the initials LH and a date from 1998. That detail sparked immediate suspicion. Leonard Hargrove, Annie's husband, had vanished in 2009. Annie had claimed he walked out on her during a fight and never returned. Police at the time had believed it, citing lack of evidence and no signs of foul play. But now, standing over a skeleton in the woods, wearing a ring that bore his initials, investigators saw the full picture beginning to form. DNA testing later confirmed the remains belonged to Leonard. His skull had been fractured in 3 places. He had been Annie's first victim, years before any guest ever arrived at Hollow Creek. The timeline had shifted. Annie hadn't just snapped in 2016. She had likely been harboring a murderous secret for over a decade. The burial pattern showed chilling thought. Leonard was buried deeper, away from the others, as if he wasn't part of the same narrative, as if he had been the trigger, not just the first chapter. The guest murders followed a disturbingly similar process, suggesting Annie had refined her methods over time. With this new evidence, a warrant was issued for her arrest. Authorities were no longer dealing with a suspicious old woman. They were pursuing a methodical, long-term killer who had hidden in plain sight for years. Annie Hargrove was arrested in the early hours of a foggy October morning. She was found sitting on the same creaking porch where she had once welcomed travelers with warm tea and soft smiles. Her demeanor remained unchanged as officers approached, calm, composed and eerily detached. When handcuffed, she offered no resistance. There were no outbursts, no confessions, just silence. The house, long abandoned and decaying, stood as a monument to the horrors buried beneath its floorboards and scattered across the surrounding forest. News of Annie's arrest spread quickly. The small town of Dunwich, once known for its scenic beauty and tranquil charm, became the epicenter of media attention. Reporters swarmed the area, digging into Annie's past, piecing together her history. They found fragments of a lonely, reclusive life. After Leonard's disappearance, Annie had withdrawn from the community, shuttering herself inside the guest house and speaking to almost no one. She had no children, few friends, and even fewer visitors, except, of course, for her guests. Psychological. Experts were brought in to assess her mental state. Some believed Annie had developed a form of predatory psychosis, perhaps triggered by years of emotional abuse or isolation. Others argued she was simply a cold, calculating killer who had mastered the art of appearing harmless. Investigators found journals in the house that hinted at her thoughts, disconnected ramblings, cryptic notes about control, silence, and purity. Pages were filled with symbols, names, and dates. While they didn't explicitly confess to the murders, the tone and timing matched each disappearance. In court, Annie remained expressionless. The prosecution presented overwhelming forensic evidence: personal items found in the basement, the burial sites with matching DNA, and Claire Renshaw's harrowing testimony. The gold ring linked her to her husband's murder, and a chilling pattern emerged. Each victim had been chosen, carefully isolated, and silenced without a trace. The defense attempted to argue diminished responsibility, citing mental instability and years of social withdrawal. But the jury was unmoved. After a 6-week trial, Annie Hargrove was found guilty on all counts: 5 counts of murder and multiple counts of unlawful confinement and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led out of the courtroom, she turned once toward the gallery, eyes scanning the crowd. No tears, no remorse, just a vacant stare that unsettled everyone in the room. The guest house was demolished soon after the trial. Locals said it was the only way to rid the town of its lingering curse. Where Hollow Creek once stood is now an open field, overgrown and quiet. A small wooden cross was placed near the site by the families of the victims, a simple tribute to lives taken too soon and the horrors hidden in plain sight. Years later, the case of Annie Hargrove would remain one of the most chilling true crime stories in the region's history, a tale of a gentle host with a monstrous secret and a house that lured its victims with warmth only to swallow them whole.